Hi, everyone. We're going to wait just another minute or two here to let everyone sign in. So we will be with you in just a moment. Hi, everyone. On behalf of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, I would like to welcome you all today. A particular welcome to our co-hosts, WISE Netherlands, as well as the UN Chair at ISCA, and to our distinguished panelists. We're very excited to be speaking with you today on such an important issue. October 31st marks the 20th anniversary since UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, which globally launched the Women, Peace, and Security agenda across multiple security platforms. In the succeeding years, terrorism, violent extremism, and the nature and intensity of conflict has continued to impact women around the world. At the same time, women have increasingly emerged as important actors within and beyond the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, including as members of violent extremist groups. In this webinar, our distinguished panel will assess how 1325 has adapted and can continue to evolve to address the challenges of international peace and security. A panel of our leading experts and practitioners from around the world will address this issue and a number of leading questions, including how have terrorism and violent extremism impacted the Women, Peace, and Security agenda? In turn, how has the Women, Peace, and Security agenda influenced counterterrorism and CVE? How have UN Security Council or individual member states advanced or restricted the Women, Peace, and Security agenda within the UN? And what should be the key aims of women, peace, and security going forward? Before introducing our speakers today, for those that are less familiar with our work, I'd like to quickly introduce the International Center for Counterterrorism. ICCT is an independent think and do tank based in The Hague, working to provide research, evidence-based policy advice, and practical on-the-ground solutions on matters regarding counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, with a special focus on prevention and rule of law. The organization was founded in 2010, and in November we are celebrating our 10th anniversary, and we're organizing a series of online events and key releases with leading experts in the field of counterterrorism as we discuss the past 10 years in this field, key innovations in counterterrorism, and future directions and problems in this work and in this field. More information on how to register is on our website, icct.nl/10years. That's 10 years. A couple quick housekeeping points here. There will be approximately 30 minutes for question and answer after the panelists have spoken today. And if you'd like to ask a question, please do submit it at any time during the briefing using Zoom's Q&A feature. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can, but please keep your questions succinct. Finally, please help us improve future live briefings by completing the very short post-event survey that'll pop up on your screen when you leave this briefing. I'm going to hand this over to Vanessa, President of WISE Netherlands. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joanna. Sorry, it's always a trap for young players. My name is Dr. Vanessa Newby. I'm the president of WISE chapter of the Netherlands chapter of Women in International Security, pronounced WISE. WISE is a premier global organization dedicated to advancing the leadership and professional development of women in the field of international peace and security. We support research and policy engagement initiatives on critical international security issues, particularly on the nexus between gender and security. Our main area of focus is the Women, Peace and Security agenda, with a minor focus on justice institutions, given we're based here in The Hague. Now, WISE Netherlands is an affiliate of a larger organization, WISE Global, which has around 30 chapters worldwide. Our members include professionals, civil servants, academics, NGOs, embassy staff, politicians, students, and members of the general public. Our base here in The Hague is Leiden University. Please do consider joining to stay and in order to stay informed about our upcoming events. Now, I'd like to introduce you today to our 4 distinguished speakers. Our first speaker is Her Excellency Ambassador Sahar Ghanem, who is the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Yemen to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. She is also the non-resident ambassador to Sweden and Norway. Ambassador Ghanem is also permanent representative of the Republic of Yemen to the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Our second speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Ella van den Heuvel, who is the current gender advisor to the Dutch Chief of Defense. Ella has twice served as gender advisor in the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, ISAF, and twice in Lebanon for UNIFIL, the United Nations Force in South Lebanon. Our third speaker is Professor Jane Huckabee, who is a clinical professor of law at Duke University. Prior to joining Duke, Professor Huckabee most recently served as human rights advisor to UN Women, focusing on women and conflict, gender equality, and constitutional reform in post-Arab Spring countries, and the use of gender and human rights indicators in national security policy frameworks. And last but certainly not least is our fourth speaker, Azadeh Moawene, who is the Gender Project Director for the International Crisis Group. Azadeh is a journalist, writer, and academic who's been covering the Middle East for nearly 2 decades. Azadeh has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, and the London Review of Books, amongst many outlets. She is the author of 3 books and 1 co-authored with Shirin Ebadi called Iran Awakening. Her most recent book is entitled Guest House for Young Widows. So on that note, I would now like to first invite Ambassador Ghanem to speak.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Vanessa, and thank you all organizers of this event for inviting me to be one of the panelists. Maybe I need to mention that I'm neither a specialist in counterterrorism and terrorism affairs, nor an expert in women and peace women in peace and security. However, I need to mention that I was one of the women who benefited of the implementation of the Resolution 1325 when it was in the Yemeni case. I was a member of the National Dialogue Conference, and that was one of the main reconciliation process that happened in the contemporary history of Yemen. And I would never been able to be there representing millions of Yemenis without the efforts of the UN based on that resolution. So thank you for that efforts. Thank you for the resolution that gave many of the Yemeni women the chance to be at the table, equally at the table, effectively, and being able to deliver the voices, not only of women, but of all the Yemeni citizens. So that's how I want to start. I believe when we speak about Yemen, we cannot only speak about the counter-terrorism efforts and how to the integration of women and gender agenda in that effort, because it will be only very, you know, small portion of the whole image. I would like to go to also mention some of the political participation, because without political participation of women, I think the presence of women in peace and security will not be so much improved. So I know we have very limited time. This is why I will not be able to say everything. And this is a little difficult. However, I will try my best to conclude within the 10 minutes. So the main points for Yemen, or the main milestones for the Yemeni women, let me start with a very recent history, and that will be the 2011, where the presence of the Yemeni women were so much clear. Their participation in the demonstrations against the regime made it possible for them to be represented in the peace process and the transitional process that started because of that uprising. I'm speaking here about the Arab Spring uprising. With that very clear, or with that tremendous participation of women, we could see how then the international efforts, the diplomatic efforts led by the UN security, led by the UN special envoys, could really manage to have women at the table. From that point on, we could see a big change on speaking about the importance of involving Yemeni women effectively in different fields and sectors, including military and security, peace negotiations. So many of the outcomes spoke about the women empowerment and gender gender mainstreaming in different fields. But one of the most important was the quota of women, 30% in the elected and the appointed councils and committees. So that was very important, because it helped that women have a base, a legal base that will help them later to be in different decision-making levels. So that's what that was the main, let me say, milestone for the Yemeni women in their presence, in their participation, based again on the based on the resolution 1325. However, as we may know, that then we had the situation getting in a different way, the collapse of the political process. And from there, we can also start speaking about the different face of women insecurity and the effect of terrorism, radicalization on women presence. So from the point of the collapsing of the political process in Yemen, and I'm referring here to September 2014, when the Houthis invaded the capital Sana'a. From that point on, first of all, the very short time that women could start be part of different stages of the peace process, here the National Dialogue Conference and later the Constitution Drafting Committee, it doesn't have the same power, because now the voices of guns, if I may say, are louder than the voices of diplomacy, negotiations, and the presence of the civic groups. So that was the time when this period of participation, empowerment, that at the beginning, I mean, of the whole thing started also to collapse or seeing kind of a decline. On the other hand, we started seeing how women are used by some of the terrorist and radical groups. Here I may mention, by the way, to the Houthis, but before the Houthis, we had Al-Qaeda also in Yemen, as you may know. So Al-Qaeda before had the Yemenis, they don't have really the focus on using or recruiting Yemeni women in a larger scale. They were involved in some of their operations on the ground, but usually the focus was to have these women as family, family-centered roles. But with the Houthis, we started to have, started to see a trained group of women called as Zainabiyat, and those women has different roles, including keeping system among women, preaching, but also raids, but also having intelligence kind of roles, and they were involved in different, let me say, human rights violation, women rights also violation, and they were involved based on some reports by national or NGOs, I mean non-governmental NGOs. They were mentioning that these women or these groups, military trained group, were also involved in gender-based violations. So that was maybe in the Yemeni case the first time that we see more systematic approach in having women with radical group, extremist group, implementing extremist agendas also, and being part of the security efforts of that militia. However, that involvement in this level did not really reflect on the higher level. So their role is still in the implementation role, which is the grassroots, but you will never see any woman being represented in at the table or within the negotiation process representing the Houthi militia. So you can see also in that, you will see them being part of the operations, but or the implementation level, but never as decision makers or policy drafting level 2. That is from the side of the the terrorist groups in Yemen. But from the side of the government, and here I'm representing the government, I should not be shooting my leg, as they say. However, it is also very sad that our government that represents the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference, which states clearly that women should be empowered in all or in different levels of decision making. And as I said, the quota, the 30% of the quota. So we expected that women will also be presented in the cabinets, will be presented in the even the local levels. Like we were lobbying for having women governors in Yemen for the first time, but that has not been achieved, unfortunately. We were also expecting to see more women again in different levels of the government, but barely we see women in the current cabinet, and barely we see women in the peace negotiations, like what happened in Kuwait, like what happened in Geneva, Peel, Stockholm Agreement. maximum one woman from that delegation. And when it comes to the security arrangements, like the Stockholm Agreement one, you don't see any women presented there. So again, women are still limited in the level of implementation. They are excluded from the decision-making process, and they are excluded from the policy drafting when it comes to sectors and fields like military and security and peacemaking sometimes too. I believe that this is not something that can be changed easily. However, as we could see during the beginning of the national dialogue, there was a serious, and here I'm saying a serious pressure from diplomatic channels, from the UN, from the international community to have women. So I know we have only 1 minute now, but I just want to prove that by saying a funny story, sad and a funny story at the same time. That was during the national dialogue when one of the very conservative religious parties had needed to participate in the national dialogue, and they had to bring a woman to participate there. So one of that women was one day lecturing us, the audience of the national dialogue, and saying women should not be part of political, audience or decision or such kind of discussions. And we were shocked because you are here for political purposes. How you are now calling for not? But you can also imagine that because there was a serious pressure for having women, we could see that women, although she was calling for the opposite, but still it is a good proof how when you have a serious well, you will find a way.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ghanem. And it's just so great to hear what's going on the ground in these situations, you know, because we're all very removed and abstract here in the Netherlands from the conflicts that are taking place in the Middle East currently. So thank you very much for your open and honest intervention on what the situation is in Yemen currently. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry we are so short of time. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Lieutenant Colonel Ella van den Heuvel.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to say thank you, Sahar, for your interesting, your interesting speech, but all you shared with us. And I think it's, we can be so proud of you. That's the first comment I would like to make. So now I would like to start 20 years ago, where we started with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And the years went fast, but can we say that as well for the progress we've made so far? So today we speak about the Women, Peace and Security agenda in relation to terrorism and violent extremism. And many researchers and organizations, for example, like the UN or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, have been publishing about this topic, and today I will highlight some of their valuable information. Now, the Security Council Resolution 2242 explicitly highlights the role of women in countering violent extremism and addresses the impact of the rise of extremism on the lives of women through displacement as well as direct and indirect violence. But what has been the effect of the resolution? Are women significantly involved in national security planning? Do they have any influence on the decisions and actions that affect the lives of millions of women and girls across the globe, living through situations of extremity and violence? Now, gender roles and dynamics are critical to the internal functioning of the violent extremist groups. These groups often use financial incentives to radicalize men and women to violence, playing into the masculine gender norms of breadwinning and women's economic vulnerability. So, what can we learn from that? What we learn is that efforts to counter and prevent violent extremism have to adequately understand the roles women and men play in violent extremist groups, and how gender norms and socially constructed concepts of masculinity and femininity are manipulated by these groups to advance their recruitment efforts. Now, do we pay enough attention to the interlinkages between gender, insecurity, terrorism, and violent extremism? For sure, they need to be better understood. So, but how can we better understand them? Critical questions need to be explored, such as, what does a gender-sensitive approach to the prevention of violent extremism look like? How can women play a role in identifying symptoms of violent extremism in their families and communities, in countering extremist narratives, and in preventing family members from falling victims to violent extremist organizations? How can women and men support gender-sensitive strategies to prevent violent extremism? And more generally, how can women contribute to the prevention of violent extremism at the global, regional, and national level? Now, often we see that women's participation in governance and decision-making remains weak, limiting their ability to engage, influence, and inform policies on preventing and countering violent extremism. Now, last year, the OSCE developed a handbook on understanding the role of gender in preventing and countering violent extremism and the radicalization that lead to terrorism. This handbook reflects the OSCE commitment to supporting a gender-aware approach for the security sector in preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism. Now, I would like to highlight a few points from this handbook. Now, with my military background, I'm in particular interested in the role that security forces, and in particular uniformed women, play or can play in preventing or countering terrorism. Evidence shows that police forces whose composition also includes uniformed men and women representing religious, ethnic, and racial minority populations may help build trust between law enforcement agencies and communities. Now, trust and communication between security actors and communities must be improved. I have seen that on the ground myself as well. While successful civil society efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism and terrorism take into account the importance of families, women, youth, educators, and religious and community leaders, here the security sector has historically been slower in embracing diversity, including aspects related to gender. This can also be seen in the percentage of women working in the security sector, which is still too low, as well in the common lack of gender sensitivity in military and police services that engage directly with communities. Now, if a police force is representative of the population it is tasked to protect, this can help in addressing such grievances. Research has found that police women are critical for enhancing the operational effectiveness of police forces, including the reduction of violence and building trust with the local communities. They are much more likely to detect and deter the occurrence of human rights abuses, to restrain from using excessive force, and to de-escalate tension efficiently. So, uniformed female personnel may be particularly more effective in preventing and countering violent extremism and terrorism efforts, and in collecting vital information about security threats in context where gender differences and cultural expectations restrict men from accessing certain communities. Now, in such context, there are also cases in which only female police officers can serve as the first responders in the care of female victims of terrorist attacks. If a community has had negative experiences with male officers in the past, female uniformed personnel may receive a better response. Women's presence in development and implementing national and regional strategies, policies, and programs on preventing and countering violent extremism and terrorism may allow the inclusion of more diverse stakeholders willing and able to come to the table in consultations. So ultimately, this allows such strategies, policies, and programs to be more inclusive. To conclude, a greater understanding of the scope of women's involvement in violent extremism and terrorism is necessary for a comprehensive approach to preventing and countering the threat. Now, I'm coming to my last 2 points. Are we on track with the implementation of our WPS agenda? In my opinion, we're moving forward far too slowly, and our rate of progress is incompatible with the gravity of the problem. So what can we do better in the next 20 years then? In my opinion, we should work even harder on the implementation of all the policies and recommendations related to the Women, Peace and Security agenda that have been made in these last 20 years. We simply need more action. Action is critical to build a sustainable and peaceful world for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. That was such an interesting, a different angle. Your point about bringing men into the conversation, absolutely. It cannot just be a women-only issue. We have to work together with men. And of course, it's not a zero-sum game. You know, we don't win at everyone else's expense. And your need for diversity in police and military and security forces, yes, extremely valuable, especially at this current time. Thank you so much. It's with great pleasure now I introduce our next speaker, who's also a fellow Australian, Professor Jane Huckabee.
Thank you, Dr. Newby, and thank you, Dr. Cook and O'Malley as well for the invitation to really reflect on the lessons learned and way forward at the 20th anniversary of 1325, but also really thinking through how the WPS agenda also intersects with the counter-terrorism and preventing violent extremism or countering violent extremism agendas. And I've got just a few points to make. The first overarching point is to really recognize that the two agendas, the WPS, Women, Peace and Security, and the CT agendas have largely been siloed in their development and implementation, despite the heavy coincidence of the timing of their inception. This has had really quite significant impacts for the type of gendering that has been done in the space of counterterrorism, CT, and PVE, CVE, as well as how gender priorities have been set or not set in the counterterrorism and PVE space. So just on the type of gendering that has been done, and this is again to really encourage us to really interrogate where the gaps are on the WPS agenda. For a long time, the failure of WPS stakeholders to engage in the counterterrorism and PVE, CVE space has meant that the gendering happened without them, like in these areas, and instead was very much taken up by primarily security actors, concerned more about the ways in which gender could enhance security rather than the ways in which gender could enhance human rights, and whose vision of gender mainstreaming was often quite thin, meaning that gender has been treated as equal to women. It has often involved perpetuating gendered stereotypes about mothers' roles in families as women as peaceful, and has really failed to tackle the question of masculinities in the CT and PVE/CVE space. The second point, and I'm really, again, thinking about how WPS has impacted CT and PVE and vice versa, is the siloing has really meant that the protection prong of the women, peace and security agenda hasn't effectively infused the counterterrorism and PVE and CVE space. And that's really skewed the priorities on the gender lens in our national security field. Again, to be very concrete, what gendering counterterrorism and PVE, CVE has really meant in practice is focusing on 4 things. Women as victims of prescribed groups, gender and involvement in prescribed groups, women's engagement as security actors, and the gendered fallout from national security measures. However, not all those policy areas have been given equal attention in the CT and PVE, CVE space. In particular, states have deprioritized analysing how their ostensibly neutral counterterrorism measures may actually have adverse gendered fallouts. And they similarly have not ensured paying attention to the rights of victims of women and girls who have suffered violations at the hands of terrorist groups. And so here, what we have seen by virtue of the siloing at WPS and CT and CVE and PVE has been a dropping out of the protection prong at WPS and somewhat of an emphasis on the participation of women in security sectors at the expense of looking at the full range of the ways in which we think about gender in national security policies. The third area where we've been slightly remiss in bringing lessons from WPS agenda into the CT and PVE, CVE space has been really continuing to push a somewhat myopic focus on sexual violence by terrorist groups in our policy responses to terrorism and violent extremism. And that's really become very evident in the recent uptick in attention to the role of trafficking by terrorist organizations, which has really come with a whole bunch of risks that we knew in the WPS space that really haven't come into our CT and PV space, which is securitizing our response to trafficking in persons, failing to look at how recruitment to prescribed groups may actually constitute trafficking, and failing to look at the different patterns of trafficking in which terrorist groups engage by instead really focusing on sexual violence by these groups. The fourth sort of area I'd like us to really think and challenge ourselves to think more critically about with regard to the intersection of the WPS agendas and the CT and PVE agendas is that in both spheres, WPS and national security, the binding human rights norms have been really sidelined in favor of talking about Security Council resolution imperatives or other policy directives. So for example, we tend to talk about Security Council Resolution 2242 from 2015, which did call for the greater integration of WPS and national security. We tend to put that up as being the starting point for enhancing the role of gender considerations in national security policies, when actually our binding norms around non-discrimination, around equality, also mandate women and girls' engagement in decision-making areas that impact their lives. And so by virtue of sort of really evacuating those human rights norms from both spaces, we're left in a situation where we ignore adverse impacts of national security policy on women and girls and advance a very thin basis or rationale for justifying women's engagement in these spaces. There's 2 more points on, sort of the critical reflections on the intersection of WPS and CT and PV, CVE. Is there are linkages between these agendas? And again, I think we have to really be much more thoughtful about the fact that these are both agendas that have grown up like in the last 20 years. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the era of counterterrorism architecture that came with that. And there are linkages, but we have sometimes occasionally conflated the 2 agendas and treated them as synonymous, and without really acknowledging that there are times when counterterrorism and PVE will not have a conflict nexus, will not have a post-conflict nexus. And the risk of putting those 2 together are quite acute. It tends to encourage a legal framework that centers humanitarian law, notions of exceptionalism in addressing terrorism and violent extremism, rather than thinking through the ways in which counterterrorism and PVE, CVE should always be informed by a human rights-based approach. And what has been particularly tricky by taking out these human rights norms, by treating them, the humanitarian law framework has been governing in this space, by returning to Security Council resolutions rather than binding human rights treaties, is that gendering has in some contexts been seen as an alternate to protecting human rights, that states can gender policies in the national security sphere as a way of showing their goodwill in relation to national security in ways that actually may contribute to women washing of national security policies. And so many of us who work in this space have really seen the very strange specter of governments being really at ease with gendering national security policies, and more at ease than doing so than doing the human rights work, like in these spaces. And in this way, a gendering of national security without the human rights has led to new forms of gender security harms. And I want to give one example here, which is feminist lenses on women's engagement in violence, which assume that all women support terrorist groups is uniform, that their support is voluntary, that their support is dangerous. And that can really be traced to current resistance to efforts to repatriate women and girls from Syria and Iraq. By virtue of sometimes collapsing the WPS and CTE and PV agendas without much more nuance in how they really interrelate, it has also led to women, peace and security stakeholders redefining their work through the lens of PVE and CVE to satisfy the demands of donors and governments and intergovernmental institutions. And that in turn leads to quite significant risks about securitization, instrumentalization, and co-option of the women, peace and security agenda in this omnipotent national security space in which we operate. My final point, and again, to really think about these intersections and to set the agenda as to how we need to move forward in enhancing the WPS agenda. From a human rights perspective, neither the WPS agenda nor the counterterrorism or PV-CVE agenda has really taken on how to develop an account of the gendered experience of men, women, boys, and girls that takes sufficient account of the complex interplays between state and non-state actors. And particularly one concept that has really come very clearly through the work that we have done in the International Human Rights Clinic at Duke Law is the idea of squeezing, that many women's actors, women's rights groups feel caught between prescribed groups on the one hand and coercive governmental responses on the other. And like one example of that is in the arena of counterterrorism financing rules, where these rules are being used to crack down on women's groups, so crackdowns by governments, and these on women's groups who are already at risk by virtue of operating and engaging with prescribed groups. So I think one key challenge for the WPS agenda moving forward is to find ways in which to infuse a protection mandate into the counterterrorism and violence terrorism space, to ensure human rights goals are infused into the CT and PVE space rather than relying on arguments about the ways in which women's engagement makes security better, like thinking for much more intrinsic based arguments for advancing women's engagement in this space. Third challenge for the women, peace, security agenda moving forward is to develop a much more complex account of state and interstate and non-state gendered harms. And finally, to also really think through the ways in which the WPS agenda cannot be co-opted and securitized in an omnipotent security environment.
Problem with these talks is we never get to hear the applause for all these wonderful talks that you're giving. Thanks so much, Jane. You really drew our attention to really so many salient issues, but you know, this idea that if we don't engage, then someone else will do it for us. I thought that was a great point to make. And also, you know, when that happens, we find an essentialization of gender being obtained not just by terrorist groups, but also by the practitioners themselves. So we have a holistic, unfortunately, both sides are essentializing gender. And thank you again also for bringing our attention to the sort of multiple aspects of WPS. You tend to find it same with protection of civilians. These agendas kind of treated as gender neutral and gender kind of added on to one side, and that need to engage holistically with every aspect of the WPS agenda, absolutely essential. Thank you so much. And with regret, because I've so enjoyed listening to all these talks, our final speaker, but very much an interesting one, Azadeh Moaveni.
Thank you so much. And also to Joanna for the invitation. Such a pleasure to be here alongside all of you, Sahar, Ella, Jane. It's really a privilege. I think I'll be echoing a lot of what you've already heard, and perhaps kind of casting some of it in the context of certain geographic regions and areas that we at Crisis Group have covered these issues. Certainly, I concur that WPS principles really have not penetrated the security frameworks and architectures that we're talking about. Echoing Ella that, women's genuine integration at top levels of security decision making is lacking, and at the same time, echoing Jane that states' counterterrorism policies, CVE policies are increasingly impacting women themselves and sometimes instigating women's recruitment or their affiliation with militancy in certain contexts. At Crisis Group, we've looked at some of these dynamics in specific recent contexts where they've been especially pronounced. Our work on the Al-Hol detention camp in Syria, where women affiliated with ISIS and their children are being held in what seems to be now permanent de facto detention, deprived of citizenship rights and refused repatriation. Somehow there's a massive gap in the demobilization, prosecution, and rehabilitation pathways that should be offered to these women. They are being exceptionalized by states around the world, the 52 to 60 states that they originate from. So we see that even 20 years into WPS, 5 years into its ambitious and explicit integration with conflict prevention and post-conflict recovery, key states that are the most robust advocates of this agenda find themselves in practice unable to deal with many of the very thorny political complexities presented by women actors who are engaged in militant political behavior in very complex ways. In Iraq, some of our recent work has looked at how Iraq's counterterrorism approach to the problem of so-called ISIS families has contributed to a long-term displacement crisis. Tens of thousands of women held in detention camps in Iraq after the vanquishment of ISIS, ongoing displacement because of communal and multi-layered barriers to return. Essentially, these women and their children are living in a kind of ongoing exile within Iraq because they cannot get security clearances, birth certificates for their children born under ISIS territory. In these camps, they're exposed to sexual exploitation. They are unable to work. Their children cannot access schools or services. And they have very little say in the outcomes or the pathways back home that are available to them, because so often security arrangements are brokered between local government, militias, and tribes. So we see that even in multiple contexts of post-conflict recovery, that these pathways and ways of ensuring that women have a say in how they are reintegrated into society, and even at the state level, much is lagging behind. Another sort of theme of our work that's presented some of these issues is women in militancy. I think everyone's echoed the importance of really WPS and the security sphere evolving into a much more nuanced understanding of women's participation. In particular, for example, some of our work on women and Al-Shabaab in Somalia. We found that women played such an important social base for Al-Shabaab, helping it recruit, raise funds, even carrying out operations. But their motivations for that were highly complex and very often factored in a need to seek out some security in an atmosphere where sexual and gender-based violence was rife. Much of this was not understood in the CVE programming that targeted them. So kind of seeing context to context places where WPS principles were not infusing either donor-funded and managed CVE programs, and indeed so many other contexts where states' counterterrorism policies were actually part of the problem. When the anniversary approached this year, we decided at Crisis Group to work on a report that would do a sort of stock taking of the ways in which the two agendas have intermingled. I think there are lots of different ways of talking about that. I think Jane really encapsulated it. sometimes they're conflated. They're often, gender is mainstreamed by security actors. And WPS has arguably been, the community of WPS advocates has arguably been a little bit reluctant and ambivalent to really engage in the security space. So leaving the mainstreaming to actors who are motivated largely by security and perhaps insufficiently attentive to rights. So this report that we have that's coming out in just a couple of weeks looks at 4 particular challenges. We thought it would be important to look at these questions from the ground up and to look at how women, peace builders, human rights defenders, very often those categories also overlap in a number of different contexts where CVE programming is particularly substantial, is where we looked at. So we spoke to dozens of women activists in Somalia, Kenya, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tunisia, and Kyrgyzstan, as well as a whole host of donors and different UN officials and those involved in implementing programming. Our findings, taking into account that donors are not monolithic, that they engage with their beneficiaries in different ways, and there's a real range of types of interactions and types of CVE programming. What we found was that CVE, as practiced in these spheres, for the most part, led to four types of dynamics, most of which were not beneficial to women. The first was that it distorted the work of local women's groups. Many women activists said that the way that donors structured their funding and approached the idea of violence prevention in their communities obliged them to shift their priorities away from what they felt was most relevant to their community, which might have been gang violence, it might have been FGM, it might have been all sorts of things that didn't always fit within the neat CVE rubric. We found that certainly the case in Tunisia. Women's groups reported that they wanted to work on police abuses and harassment and women's unemployment or economic exclusion, particularly in sort of deprived inner areas of Tunisia, and that this did not fit, that there was much more of a expectation for them, and the funding sort of expectations for them was that they should be holding PVE workshops to discuss ideological linkages to militancy. Similar examples in Kyrgyzstan, where NGOs that were working on women's empowerment found themselves having to switch their focus to violent extremism and actually incentivized to categorizing certain groups like an obscure band of dervishes as violent extremists for the purposes of securing funding. The second dynamic that we found was that often engaging women in CVE activities put them in harm. The way that women's activism was often at the level of programming aligned with government CVE work meant that women activists were viewed as tilted to one side of the conflict, the government side, which is often associated with state and security services who engage in so many abuses. Lots of examples of this, Nigeria and in Kenya, women's activists who were threatened, who were monitored, their interventions with local at-risk youth were monitored by police who were surveilling those youth, intervened in one instance to kill a young man that a woman activist had been doing an intervention with. The third thing that we found was that many of these programs that sort of tried to have hybrid CVE and WPS objectives were just often ineffective. They didn't appear to either deter militancy and were often led to sort of counterproductive results for women. In Somalia, for example, and this is something that I thought about when Ella was talking about, a police reform program that was meant to integrate female officers into a local police force, sort of skipped ahead to direct representation. And many of the women ended up working as cleaners in police stations or sitting in cars. The programming didn't address the kind of lack of authority that they would have or the marginalization that prevented their genuine contribution to that policing. So programs that are kind of focused on a short-term achievement of numbers rather than the sort of more slow, incremental change that would produce the kind of genuine representation that I think, Ella was describing, that would have real impact in police. And to finish up, the fourth dynamic that we found was the real prevalence of gender stereotyping that everyone's really talked about. This tendency for commingled CVE and WPS programs to paint women as victims or peace builders, and men as responsible, voluntary, participants in violence. The commingling seeming to sort of magnify each other's worst tendencies of stereotyping. And of course, these kinds of notions directly feed into policy. So in Nigeria, a tendency for women to be left out and lack support when they left Boko Haram, whereas men who defected and went into the state's DDR program were given skills training, education. The state really reestablished a compact with them, and they didn't tend to return back to the group. So gaps in what women are offered in terms of that kind of post-conflict recovery. So those are the four dynamics that we found, kind of filtered through these different contexts. What to do going forward? Just a couple of thoughts to close. I think certainly what's really important is to have more grassroots civil society feeding into the UN discussions about counterterrorism policy. The UN is such a hub of the WPS community, of course, and this donor space, and to have a civil society voice at the UN OCT and UN CTED, I think is quite crucial. I think donors are really big players, of course, and they need to focus on much more equitable partnerships with women's groups on the ground. More funds need to flow down because women's groups in the end don't receive very much. And especially when you count in all of that CVE programming that's being sort of double dipped as WPS, there's really a lack of resources going to straight WPS programming. And then sometimes disentangling CVE from women's work when that would be beneficial. And finally, sorry to go over, I think we genuinely and badly need an empirical base and more research on the impact of CVE on WPS and the 4 pillars of the agenda. Given the extent to which these agendas have commingled problematically in the development arms of so many UN agencies and Western governments, I think we need to have really robust research on how that impacts women. So I will end on that point. Sorry to have gone over.
Not at all. I mean, that was just, I'm so glad you brought in so many other key points around, we just keep coming back to this lack of structural changes within states that exacerbate the gendered effects of whether it's conflict or terrorism or what else, and the lack of attention to that, and this essentialization of terrorism above all else. And as you say, interrupting and disrupting existing programs on women's empowerment that are so essential to the removal of these structural barriers. So thank you so much. That was incredibly useful. And so much more, but I think that's coming up in the questions. Alana, I hand over to you as chair of the questions.
Thanks very much, Vanessa, and thank you to all the panelists for extremely interesting presentations. And we have a whole host of very interesting questions. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. My name is Professor Alana O'Malley. I have the Special Chair in United Nations Studies in Peace and Justice at Leiden University and The Hague University. The Special Chair has been created by the City of The Hague, an initiative to honour the work of the former Mayor and Foreign Minister Josias van Aarten. The chair is equally divided between the 2 universities and has a diverse research agenda. Women, peace and security, and women and peace building is, of course, one of the 3 central themes, the other 2 being a youth engagement project and a project on the invisible history of the United Nations and the Global South. All 3 of these themes are designed to generate groundbreaking research within the wider framework of the lesser known actors of the UN, and we've heard about many of them today, in order to produce new genealogies and narratives and conceptions of the UN beyond traditional views. Taking up the theme of 1325 and moving on with the discussion now, I'm delighted to begin the questions and answers session. For the first question, it's for all the panelists. Could we explore more perhaps the tension between viewing women as victims in need of protection and women as perpetrators of certain terrorist crimes in different policy realms? Is there a difficult tension present between these conceptions? And what is the best way to balance them in terms of the context of the WPS agenda? So this is for all our panelists. So does anybody want to jump in there?
I'm happy to start. That's a great question, and I think we looked at it really closely at Crisis Group when we were doing our research on the women and families detained in El Hol. I mean, what we in the end kind of urged in that report was for policymakers and indeed the media too, which is really drives many of the narratives and kind of shapes public sentiment around women as jihadi brides or, you know, certain types of actors, was the importance to acknowledge the complexity of women's roles in a group like ISIS, which at the same time that it recruited women and offered them active roles in this state building operation, it often brutalized them at the same time. So a woman who might have been recruited as a minor, but seemingly joined voluntarily, even though her judgment at that time legally is questionable, you know, might have gone on to be involved in, you know, sometimes women have been prosecuted, for example, for pillage or for membership. But at the same time, you know, I spoke to women who joined from the UK and decided quite quickly 2 months in that it was very brutal and that they wanted to leave. And when they tried to, they had their children taken away from them as leverage by the group. They were put in prisons for weeks on end for trying to escape. So the importance of not looking at women who've joined militant groups as a monolith. There are certainly complexities and hierarchies. Some are much more vulnerable due to the circumstances of their recruitment and what they've potentially what they've suffered, the sexual abuse they might have suffered at the hands of the group. Some might be still committed to militancy. And we see in El Hol, you know, a whole range of these types of behaviors. So I think repatriation policies that also make the case, you know, politicians and policymakers have to make the case to publics that women are not monolithic, that there are those who are more vulnerable, there are those who are repentant, those who were recruited as minors, and those who might still display support, and then a spectrum alongside that. So I think that's certainly a start, just sort of breaking this crucible of the notion that you know, that women were either, you know, simpletons persuaded to join or complete monsters who, you know, should be, you know, tucked away in Guantanamo in the desert for the end of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to kind of really diversify our impressions of the types of women we're also talking about and the roles that they play. Questions are building up, so I'm going to move quickly to question 2. By the way, I should just quickly say I'm sorry that I have a little willful woman in the background now, but hopefully we won't hear any more from her for the rest of our discussion. Question 2. So this is again directed towards perhaps Jane or Azadeh. Is there any help offered to the wives and children of foreign terrorist fighters by the UN and its agencies?
Should I jump in first of all in talking through what the help should look like? So a couple of different things, again, informed very much by a human rights-based approach to these questions. The first of which is repatriation of women and girls from Syria and Iraq, and particularly through not creating de facto hierarchies among mothers or among children. Like, so for example, when you strip citizenship of mother and then repatriate the child, you know, these are all ways in which repatriation is being uneven and creating hierarchies that are not founded in the human rights-based approach. The second one is, as I mentioned this too, recognition of birth. So thinking through like in ways in which you can recognize birth certificates issued by prescribed groups, but also being very thoughtful about when to recognize marriages and acknowledging that there are moments in which marriages may not be what we would regard as a legal marriage, others in which they should be a foundation for family reunification purposes in foreign countries. The third is really reflecting, as there's point here as well, is a much more nuanced case-by-case assessment on return of women and children as to what the treatment should look like. And that really has to be founded on information about the ways in which individuals were recruited to the group, roles performed whilst there, and other factors about their experience too. And the final piece that we're hearing a lot about in our current work is also not only focusing on sort of the women and children, but also thinking through what treatment is happening with regard to their families in their home countries. And so not penalizing, for example, financial contributions that these families are making to women and children that are not linked to prescribed groups, that are to support access to food and other services, not penalizing those families through counter-terrorism financing rules on material support.
Yeah, I mean, I think this opens up some fascinating discussions about remittances and perhaps the regulation of remittances in some regards, but also because as a historian, I'm also thinking about the Nansen passport, right, which was initially created around the League of Nations around these kind of questions of the recognition of documents for women. So actually it opens up all kinds of interesting historical avenues also in precedent set in these regards. Okay, before we go on too much with that, let's have the next question. So this is with regard to the discussion of the role of Houthi women in the current conflict for the first time as a belligerent group. And I think this question is very much directed towards you, Sahar. The question is, there hasn't been much attention to this demographic in women. How do you believe that they could be considered or engaged in future negotiations and settlements in the Yemeni conflict? So I think you might have to just unmute your...
Yeah. I'm still not able to get used to this Zoom meetings. But anyway, for the question, one of the main challenges that is facing the current peace process or the making of peace in Yemen, the discussion that is happening, it's not taking into consideration very important challenges. One of them is this kind of challenges, not only women, but also fighters in general. Their numbers in Yemen is really increasing because of the current war. All the militia from one side is recruiting more men and women as fighters. From the other sides also, we can see in different places that we have increasing in the number of fighters from one side, but also radical groups from the other side. This challenge or this problem, it seems that it's not one of the priority of the discussions that is taking place nowadays. And I believe this is very dangerous because that will be like, a bomb in the future. If we don't find from now a real solution for this, how to reintegrate those fighters, women and men, how to find a way also for children, because also children in Yemen are recruiting in very high numbers as fighters. And all that need to be part of the discussions today. Unfortunately, all the discussion today is about stopping the hostilities. And in the end, now we are more than 5-6 years discussing this, and we are going nowhere with it. So I believe the approach taking place now is not helping in solving this, but it is very important, sure, to make this as a priority, women and children and fighters in general to be part of the solution. One thing I want to add, I mean, in general, we don't see like a strategy for using women as de-radicalization agents in Yemen. Most of the strategies, if they will involve women, they will be involved in security forces that is dealing, in a way or another with again, the implementation level of those strategies against the terrorist groups or the radical groups, but we are ignoring the role of the ordinary Yemeni women in fighting terrorism ideologies. I believe that's very important to think about it also for the future of Yemen. One of the consequences of the war that we see more conservative and radical way of thinking spreading in the country because of lacking the opportunities and many other factors. Also flourishing of the radical agendas and ideologies, because it is easy to promote fighters with such kind of ideologies. So I believe we need a strategy that will involve not only those women fighters, but also even ordinary women in counter-terrorism efforts, in de-radicalization as de-radicalization agents, and having more effective role for women in civic sphere. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That's extremely comprehensive, and you really, I think, kind of highlighted not just the different avenues for women to be empowered in that regard, but also the different roles that they play at the end of that. And I think that non-monolithic conception is very important. So now we have a question for Ella. And the questioner asks, out of all sectors of the government, the military is often highlighted as that which is most resistant or slow to integrating WPS. What advice would you give to prompt more immediate and meaningful action in this field?
Yes, well, more women. More women. We need more women in the armed forces all over the world. That will absolutely make a difference, by the way. I'm not only joking, but that will make a difference. But what I also think is that my advice would be that all the armed forces in the world develop a defense action plan on 1325, which can be done through the national action plans, where all member states of the UN are being pushed to develop these national action plans. I think we should also emphasize that especially the defense sector need also to develop their own plan. And then what I would advise as well is that on the number one action in this defense action plan should be integrating gender awareness training in all education, basic training, but also management training in the armed forces, because that is needed. It all starts with this gender awareness, which is way too low still, which is so unfortunate.
Yeah. Another question that comes in is actually for all the panelists, and it really picks up on what Ella says there. And the questioner asks, what is a useful and helpful way to talk, or what tools could be employed to leadership of the security sector and strategy institutions, which tend to be predominantly male? So I think the questioner is asking, how do you get predominantly male-oriented institutions and those kind of normative environments dominated by male security actors to really engage with the question, with the issue of involving women? Is there any strategies or tools that are useful for that? And that's for everybody.
Maybe I can begin with what hasn't worked, which is, and it was mentioned by Azadeh, which is really, it works in the short term, which is focusing on the ways in which engagement in women enhances the efficacy of policies from a security perspective. And that's a very helpful short-term entry point. But what we've seen is by focusing on that security rationale for engagement, we've really evacuated the human rights-based rationale for that engagement, and have then created further gender security harms that in turn create more security challenges. And so I think, thinking through and being more reflective on what strategies we have used, which may have been needed in a sort of interim measure to gain access to these particular spaces, but which we can now see are having gendered fallouts with regard to human rights impact. So for example, I was really struck by the research that indicated that activists are now not able to focus on their own priorities they define as being key in their communities by virtue of having to fit a CT and PVE agenda. And so we're leading to this sort of outcome of where we have this mismatch between what women are engaged in and what their actual sense of the priorities are. And so I think trying to be much more intentional about what have been the opportunities created by security-based rationales for women's participation, but also what have been the fallouts from that, in the long term, for security and equality of women and girls.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, does anybody else want to come in on that question?
I might just add to what Jane very aptly said. I think that sometimes hard security bodies and hard security spheres, even if male dominated, are very responsive to persuasive analysis that has a good security outcome. So I think something that's really lacking is strong, hard security, gender expertise that is also human rights compliant and able to really have a forceful and expert analysis of a specific conflict that takes into account the hard counterterrorism concerns of security actors, but has the gender analytical background in that specific conflict to persuade those at the table to have a more nuanced kind of analysis of how different interactions, gendered interactions of that conflict, and sometimes, inflamed by security actors themselves, play a role. I think going back to something that I think a few of us mentioned before, I think the reluctance of WPS to really, and WPS community to develop a hard security expertise is a real lack, because I think we don't have a sufficient number of experts who can be at those tables and have a WPS rights-based view of what kind of security mainstreaming and gender mainstream needs to happen. So I think we have to have the WPS community occupy that space, but with much more expertise, which needs to come from resources, presumably. And where do those come from? So I think that's a kind of resource process, but also expertise gap that I think many of us kind of recognize needs to be filled in order to kind of develop things, as the question asks, how can those with these concerns be persuasive at the table?
Right, exactly. So we need to all think very differently about this, and actually maybe some of our initial premises on how these agendas are intertwined are actually coming at it from the wrong basis. I wanted to move on to a slightly more politically contentious question, and that's directed towards Azadeh, but I think that you will all be able to speak to this to some regard. And that's the question of the returning women from Syria and Iraq. And the questioner asks, this is a very contentious issue for many governments. Why should these governments facilitate the return of these women, and how should they be dealt with upon their return? So how should they be integrated into their home societies upon their return to them?
I acknowledge that it's very contentious, and there's little public appetite in many of the countries that need to repatriate to bring these people back. I think often we have to recognize that that's slightly racialized. I think very often, especially from Europe, people who joined these kinds of militant groups in Syria and Iraq are from immigrant backgrounds. I think it's not irrelevant to the discussion that they're not really seen. They're seen as easily losing their Frenchness or their Britishness or their Europeanness, even though their citizenship rights must stand. I think it also needs to be acknowledged that hundreds have already come back. So it's not as though countries across Europe are not already dealing with returnees with exactly this profile. Social care systems, police surveillance systems, family courts, already across the continent and in the UK, self-returns, as they're called, there have been dozens of women and children who've come back. So all of these countries' institutions are basically dealing with this already. So the notion that they can't deal, and the numbers really country to country are quite small, the notion that they can't deal with a few more is not really persuasive. And I think the easiest way, though, to make this case is a security case. The camps in Syria are porous. Women can be smuggled out very easily and are regularly. When I was there, women had, almost, TripAdvisor ratings for different smugglers. If there's a security concern about not bringing these women back, leaving them there is not a more secure security outcome. And you have former heads of MI6 who will say as much publicly. So it's really a problem of elected political officials who don't want to risk the electoral outcomes of doing this on their watch. People are already coming back, institutions are handling it, and the numbers are small.
If I can add to that, I think alongside emphasizing the security piece here, we do need to move from a framework of this being a question of governmental choice to anchoring the legal obligations to return individuals in Iraq and Syria. So there's been a lot of work that's been done, increasing attention to the ways in which human rights treaties of relevant governments apply extraterritorially and come with certain obligations of return. I would highlight here too, particularly obligations that exist with regard to people who were trafficked to ISIS and their obligations of repatriation that are very particular in the anti-trafficking space that we've tended to totally look over because we haven't seen any really nuanced attention to the ways in which recruitment involves trafficking. And that if you treat someone as a trafficked person rather than a terrorist, that changes your legal paradigm of thinking through your obligations with regard to that person. And so I think just buttressing the choice and security arguments with a really strong push on the legal obligation piece here is really key. And that we're seeing that shift happening as we see more and more ways in which governments are seeking to evade those obligations by stripping of citizenship by creating unrealistic hurdles about access to embassies to enable return and so forth. So I think alongside security, like really buttressing the obligation argument here. And then when people are back, we deal with individuals as we do with anyone who may have engaged in criminal activities, which is we assess on a case-by-case basis whether or not someone, should go through a procedure of a trial or some non-judicial procedure or an administrative procedure. And so there are ways in which we have the tools to handle this. It's not an exceptional space, and to really think through those precedents that we do have. And I think exactly as I said, to be much more honest about what's preventing like that and the deeply troubling approaches to both religion, race, and gender that are intersecting and informing exclusionary policies in ways antithetical to human rights obligations are actually quite clear in this space.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you myself a quick follow-up on that issue, actually. Is it your view then that, certain cases are given very high profile in this regard, right? So you could probably think of like one or two cases for the major European countries where they've been splashed all over the media and they really reveal the identity of these women. Do you think that these cases are given specific prominence in order to allow for the greater return of more women kind of behind closed doors, while one or two individuals are kind of splashed across the news? And is this simply a political strategy, or is it actually helpful because more women actually get to pass under the radar while the media is focused on one? Or is it all, in fact, incredibly kind of negative in terms of European countries really not cooperating on these issues, but also not living up to their broader human rights obligations by making an issue just of one or two cases?
I think it's a great question, Alana, because I think it's about a lot of us would look at the case of Shamima Begum, who was 15 years old when she was recruited as a child into a child marriage to ISIS. And her case has really taken such a prominent space in the UK media. It has been a very adverse reaction to her case when, under every definition of trafficking that we have, she was someone who was trafficked like as a child to ISIS, and should be relatively easy. She's also of one nationality, so we haven't got the dual nationality question. She's someone who should be a relatively easy case of return under the international human rights law and anti-trafficking law principles. And so I think what's been really particularly challenging is even these cases that we should look at as easy cases of repatriation get such resistance from the public and are really amped up by the media, like in such a way that it makes other cases of return even more like impossible. And so I think I have to think through like what cases are elevated in these spaces and how does it actually make it harder if that is the case that we would regard as one that should be amenable to sympathy, that should be amenable to easy legal argumentation about return. If we contest those cases, then what does it look like for the broader population for whom the questions might be a bit more tricky and where there may be greater volition or involvement in the activities of a prescribed group? Okay,
we're very close to the end, so I'm just going to pose one other question from our group for all the panelists. The questioner asks, regarding the essentialization of women that is so rampant in WPS, what are your recommendations for how women's groups should advocate for the inclusion of women in security and peace processes without pushing women into these boxes that are or tend to be family focused? So perhaps Ella could say a few words about this one first.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that it's all about it's all about critical mass in the first place. We need more women, and with critical mass, things will change. And then, of course, it's also about being well trained, educated, etc. But and then at the same time, if you have more women who can advocate and for the inclusion of women, and then not only being pushed in that corner as if they only stand up for their, women's issues, because it's not about issues, then the men, then they need to be supported by groups of men who are actually advocating for the same. but it all starts with critical mass, because that's what's lacking, and then critical mass of meaningful participation of these women. So over to someone else.
Thanks a lot, Ella. Sahar, would you have anything to add on this point?
Sorry, not yet, but I'm just looking at the next question, and I really would like to read something. Yes.
The next, okay, so that
Question.
Yeah, it brings us nicely to the next question then. How can we make sure that gender mainstreaming in CVE and PVE efforts is more than a token process? And has the term itself become diluted?
So one of the things that I'm noticing, as I said again, I'm not really an expert in that. However, I'm a Yemeni woman in the end, and I can be part also of my societies. We sometimes feel like, it's like a checklist procedures that come from one country to another country without localization. And this is a serious problem facing us in every, aspect of sometimes international intervention. And it is so much clear in this topic. So first of all, the localization, understanding the society you are dealing with, and then, altering or shifting your strategies, your procedures based on that. In our kind of conservative societies, you cannot deal with them like, more open societies. So sometimes you also need to understand that mentality. So when I spoke, for example, about the Houthi groups, not only they are there because of the sake of, belonging to the same families or, in my opinion, one of the main reasons behind them there is finding themselves taking leadership roles there, because they could not have those roles in other ways. So it is also very important to give the women a chance to play those leadership roles that effective roles in other way that also suit their societies. We cannot ask them to jump out of their skins, we cannot ask them to become a Western copy of women, but we can help them build stronger and effective role that will be used for counter-terrorism strategies. Another thing that I'm sometimes really noticing, as I said, I was working before with the civil society. This is why even I am calling myself the activist ambassador, and now I am working with the government, and I can see the gap between the two sides. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the UN interventions and the international community interventions, the focus is more about the civil society, and I so much understand that, because they are also very active, they are more out of the box, but also because maybe another reason, this is something I saw it when I am in the Netherlands, because it is safer. You cannot be criticized of your relations with the civil society actors, which is very important again. I'm not saying it's not important. We see great initiatives coming from the civil society, and they are usually expressing the agendas of the people, the honest agendas of the people, or the interests of the people. But at the same time, it is very difficult to not work with the official institutes and the government, and to ignore it and only focus on the civil society, especially when it comes to such kind of issues. I cannot really give an example about counterterrorism efforts, but I can say something. I see it in my work as an ambassador here, and it is also about women, or having the agenda of enhancing the women's rights. So in my work, we issue, as you know, passports for Yemeni women. And one of the conditions that is requested in that form is to have the approval of the guardians. When you look at the Yemeni law, the Yemeni constitution or the Yemeni law, there is nothing about that, nothing saying about that. I started the communication with the authorities, and they refused. They said actually clearly that they know there is nothing in the constitution or again, the laws or the regulation. However, they have kind of internal regulation, depends on traditions, and they insist on that. So with, again, it's a long story. Now we are taking forward and backward about it. But if you don't have a change from inside those governmental institution, how can you then speaking about any kind of civic engagement or efforts when the government is still institutionally undermine the role of women, undermine the existence of women, the independence of women, the identity of women. So again, I believe there should be localizing, to make it brief, localizing for the strategies to empower women in also their own ways, not only to be copies of other countries, and to be more innovative and to focus also in different actors, especially the most influential actors in changing these kind of or creating these strategies. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sahar. I think that's an extremely comprehensive answer and gives us a lot to think about. And I think that point is so well made and important to remember about the kind of the hard structure of institutions and norms that we're really facing an uphill battle with in this regard. If you come to the end of time now, unfortunately, which is really a shame since we have so many other interesting questions, and I think we could continue this discussion really much longer. But I just want to thank all the panelists so much for their fascinating contributions, and particularly for their engagement with all the different issues that we've raised today. There will be, of course, follow-up events hosted by the Chair of UN Studies, the ICCT and WISE Netherlands. So please keep an eye on your emails and on our Twitter pages. And please feel also free to sign up for our newsletters for regular updates. So we really hope to continue the discussions that we've had today and take this forward. And once again, we thank you very much for joining us.